Right, good morning. In this video, we're going to cover three things from chapter 30 on unemployment that you do need to know and understand for the exam. Uh, First is who is counted as unemployed. Second is how the unemployment rate is calculated. And third is what is meant by a discouraged worker and how do they fit into the unemployment. So let's begin here with our slide. Someone is counted as unemployed only if he or she is willing and able to work but cannot find a job. And what that boils down to be counted as unemployed, you have to be at least 16, 16 or older, not be institutionalized, not in prison, in a old folks home, or um, the other thing that I've forgotten, um, mental institution. uh, and you have to be a civilian. If you're in the military, they don't figure into the unemployment numbers. And you have to be actively looking for work. So that means that if you are, um, or make sure you know how that applies to different people. Someone who's below 16, they're not going to show up at all. They're not employed, unemployed, not a part of the labor force. They just don't figure in. Someone who is working is clearly employed, uh, whether they have a job they like, whether they're working full-time or part-time. If they're working, if they're being paid, then they are considered employed. They're doing volunteer work for some kind of organization. That's not being employed. Employed means you're being paid. Okay? If you have someone who um, isn't working, they say they would like to work, but they're not actually looking for a job, then they will not be counted as unemployed because you have to be without a job and actively looking for work, which means you have to have done something to engage in some type of activity to find a job within the last 4 weeks. Um, Moving on. Uh, so this is a useful graph to chart to keep in mind. Every person is going to fall into one of these three categories. You're working, means you're employed, you're unemployed, or you're not in the labor force. Uh, Really important to remember what the labor force is. It's not the population as a whole. The labor force is the total of the number of people who are employed, they're working, they're being paid, and the number who are unemployed. And by unemployed, we're using the definition that I just gave you. At least 16, not institutionalized. They don't have a job, and they are actively looking for work. So anyone who doesn't fit into one of these two categories is just not going to show up at all in the unemployment figures. They are not in the labor force. Um, on questions dealing with employment and unemployment, one thing you want to avoid is sometimes people have a tendency to look at the data they've been given and then they just kind of look for a way to manipulate that data and come up with an answer. Okay? They assume that everything that's been given to them is relevant. And you want to remember that you may be given data that is not relevant, just like in the real world. When you pick up the paper or you go to a website and you start reading the news, they don't tell you only the things that are relevant um, for what you're thinking about. They give you all the stuff that's happening, and you have to be able to sort out what is relevant, what's important, from what is not relevant and not important. So when you're given a question, if you have some data that's given that you don't see how that's relevant, don't worry about it. Okay? Sometimes the answer may be very, very simple. Maybe you're given 5 pieces of information, and maybe the answer is just the whole question may be really about seeing, can you read all of this information and then recognize the one thing that is relevant? Um, so that's why it's so important to understand the definitions that we're using for unemployment, for the labor force especially. Uh, in calculating the unemployment rate, this is not hard, but it provides you with a lot of opportunity to make mistakes. So you just have to be sure that you know what you're doing. Uh, the unemployment rate is defined as, uh, right here, is the definition for the unemployment rate. Okay. Remember before, we've been talking about the number of unemployed workers. Well, that would be, how many are there? 1 million, 2 million, that's a number. When we talk about the unemployment rate, that's going to be a percentage, and it is defined as the number of unemployed workers over the number of unemployed plus employed. And hopefully you remember that when you add unemployed to employed, what does that give you? That gives you the labor force. So you can remember the unemployment rate definition as the number of unemployed workers divided by the labor force. And then you multiply by 100 to convert it into percentage terms. Not a difficult calculation, but lots of opportunity to make mistakes. So let's go through this example. April 2014, there were 9.8 million people unemployed. Okay? So that, read carefully. Go back and reread it if you're not sure what you've read. People unemployed. Well, number of people unemployed, that's what's going to go in the numerator. And 145.7 million employed. Okay? Is this the number that goes in the denominator? A lot of times people will just take the numbers they're given and plug them into an equation, and they don't think very carefully about, are these the right numbers to use? Number of unemployed is definitely what you need in the numerator, but what you need in the denominator is the labor force, which again is the number of employed plus the number unemployed. So you're going to have to take this number and this number, add them together as was done here. So the unemployment rate is going to be the 9.8 million unemployed workers divided by the total labor force, which is the sum of the number of unemployed plus employed. So that gives you, 9.8 million who are unemployed, 155.5, that's the total labor force. So unemployment as a percentage of the labor force comes out to 6.3%. You divide this out, that would be 0.063. You multiply by 100, that moves the decimal place point over 2 places, and then you add the percent sign. So that's why it's 6.3%. I want to be sure that you know how to take the decimal you have here and then express that as a percentage. That calculation is not hard, but you just have to be sure that you know how to do it. And here's another example. You have 2 million people who are unemployed. Okay? We know that's going to be important. 8 million who are employed. We're asked for what is the unemployment rate. You could have other questions that say, ask you how many people are unemployed or something like that. So always read carefully to see, what am I supposed to find? Here you want the unemployment rate. And we know, I would encourage you on your blank piece of paper to, anytime you have a calculation to do, don't just jump into the calculation. You want to write down the equation and then Then plug the numbers into that equation. So this is going to be the number of unemployed workers over the labor force. So that's going to be 8 million who are unemployed. The denominator is the labor force, which is going to be the 8 million who are unemployed plus the, I'm sorry, see how easy it is to make mistakes. 2 million who are unemployed. So that's the numerator. And the denominator is the labor force, which is the number of unemployed plus the number who are employed. So that is 2 plus 8. If you multiply that out, you get 2 over 10, which is going to be 20%. I did that right. And I did. Okay. So we've talked about who's considered unemployed, who's not considered unemployed. We talked about how to calculate the unemployment rate. And last thing I want to talk about in this video is what we mean by discouraged workers. You do have people who are, they say that they want to work, they're available to work, they have looked for a job at various times within the last year, but they have not looked for a job in the last month. Okay? And why haven't they looked? Well, they say that they don't believe there are any jobs available. So this would suggest that if they thought there were jobs, then they would be out there looking. But because they think there are no jobs, they've stopped looking. That's why they're called discouraged workers. They're interested in working, but not interested enough to go out there and be looking during the last month because they don't believe there are any jobs out there. The important thing to remember here is that discouraged workers are not counted. They're not included in the official unemployment rate. So the rate that we've been calculating, they would not show up there. These discouraged workers, they are not unemployed. They're not considered a part of the labor force. They just don't show up at all in the unemployment figures, the official figures. There are other measures of unemployment that the government does calculate. The official unemployment rate we've been talking about is called U3. There are, I believe, 7 different unemployment rates that the government calculates. And these discouraged workers are included in some of those. But most of the time, you'll never hear those other unemployment rates being reported. They're easy to find if you go to the government's website, but most people aren't going to do that. The unemployment rate that you're going to hear about, sometimes called the headline unemployment rate, and also the official unemployment rate, is the one that we have been dealing with. And with that unemployment rate, discouraged workers will not show up. Okay. And here's a graph that shows you, let's see, the red is the official unemployment rate. If you include the discouraged workers, then you get the blue level, and you can see that the blue level, including the discouraged workers, is higher than the official unemployment rate, but not by a lot, but by a little bit. Okay. All right. That's all we'll do for now.